The bull went wild. It happened so fast that the world seemed to shrink to the iron ring of hooves and the high, cruel bellow that split the bright air. Clara Winslow felt the wagon jolt as if the earth itself had lurched. The seat threw her forward, the baby on her lap slipping like a small, stunned bird. June's bonnet fell away. For a breathless second, Clara saw only the dark curl of her daughter's ear and the white of an eye, and then the crowd of animals closed in. They had been clear of town by a mile, the trail a raw line of dust across the prairie. The sun lay hot on the canvas cover of the wagon. Tom Breslin kept his jaw set to the reins. His voice had been light at first, calling for the dust to die down, for a rest at the spring ahead. A loose beast, one big-bellied bull from a nearby herd, had broken free, maybe spooked by the driver's whip, maybe by a coyote's cry. One animal at first, then another, then a swath of maddened bodies. The herd's panic unfolded like a tide. Hooves struck the hard pack, the ground shivered, and then it was all motion and noise and a thick, choking cloud of dust. Clara's arms tightened, and then she felt June slip. She screamed a sound so small it took the wrong shape in her throat. No call, no name, just the raw flinch of a mother losing hold. Hands reached for them. Other travelers froze, helpless, as the herd veered and broke the lane. The wagon lurched, the axles catching, a yelp from the driver, a shout that was swallowed by the stampede. Rowan Hale saw it from 100 yards away, riding along the farther ridge with thunder beneath him and the horizon in his eyes. He had come that morning to check fence lines, the stallion's breath steaming in the dry air. He saw the fall before anyone else did, a pale shawl, the flash of a child, the panicked arc of a mother. Then the bulls, a wall of bronze and muscle, thundered down the hollow. There was a moment, only a sliver, when a man could have been moved by common sense, by the urge to keep his distance, to let the animals clear. Rowan did not think of sense. He thought of the tiny body rolling with the dust, and of a night years past when he had watched his own child slip from his hands and the river take what it pleased. The old hurt was a bright coal under his ribs. He guided thunder like a blade. He rode straight into the chaos. Thunder did not balk. Rowan cracked the reins and dropped from the saddle at speed, sliding along the animal's flank and into the thunder of hooves. For a heartbeat, he was among the beasts, breath and hide, and the thunderous concussion of a world made only of bodies that did not care. He shoved, rolled, caught at an ear, a flank, moved with a grace born of a lifetime in the saddle. Dust blinded him. The air was full of the iron smell of panic and the heavy animal close of wet breath. "Give me the baby!" he shouted, though the voice felt pointless in that heat. He saw a small fist clenched in the churn, the ribbon of a bonnet, June's little socked feet beating the ground. A bull's flank nicked his shoulder, a hoof grazed his boot, rope and leather and hair filled his view. He slid, reached, and his hands closed on the child's small body. She was warm and alive and heavier than he had expected. He cradled her to his chest and turned. Thunder reared and dug. Rowan roared and fought his way back, parting beasts with his shoulders, a tall presence men carved room for. He held June close to his heart as if she were the only steady thing left in the world. By the time he burst from the dust cloud, Clara had crawled to the wagon's side, blood on her palm from a split lip, eyes wide and empty. When Rowan came into focus, cradling her daughter, all the world narrowed to the white, upturned face of the baby and the stranger's stained shirt. He handed June up without a word. His hands trembled when he did, as if relieved not to be holding that weight any longer. "You," Clara started, then could not find the rest. Her voice was broken, small. June's chest rose and fell, a worried, quick thing. Rowan's face was set with dust and a line of blood at his temple where he'd been nicked by a horn. His palm bore a smear of a stranger's blood. He did not look at his own wound. He looked at the child as if she were a promise he had been given to keep. "You're safe now," he said, a thing said to a child and to the woman who had not known how close she had come to losing everything. "Eyes on me, breathe, little one." Someone fetched a blanket. Hands moved with the efficiency of a place that knew the suddenness of harm. Tom Breslin had not been spared the chaos. He lay farther along the trail, his cheek cut, mumbling into the dirt. A man wrapped him in a coat and dragged him from the wheel, pale and muttering. That detail, one more body to a long list of frontier accidents, made Clara's knees tremble as she clutched June. Rowan didn't let go of June until the blanket was over her. Then, finally, he stepped back and measured what the herd had done in a sweep. The broken board of a fence, a scatter of boots, a hat spinning in the dust. The driver coughed and tried to laugh a raw laugh, but it was hollow. They climbed into Thunder's shade as the sun slanted toward afternoon. Rowan asked for water. Santos, who had come bolting from the ranch at the first scream, Santos with his steady shoulders and a face like worked leather, produced a canteen and a cloth for June's head. The old ranch hand's hands were sure and quick. There was not much talking. In situations like this, talking did little besides bruise the air. Rowan insisted they come to the ranch. It was not far, a low line of boards and a stone chimney, a porch where the wind sat like an old dog. He would not leave Clara to the improvised shelter of travelers. She shook her head, then shook it again, and somehow the reflection of June's fist in her palm decided her. They loaded the little family into the spare wagon and followed the thin track home. The ranch smelled of horse and smoke and boiled coffee. Santos moved like a man who had seen too many near misses to be surprised. He set June on a blanket, stripped her bonnet, washed her cheeks with cool tea. The child blinked, world-shocked, and then latched to Clara's breast with the small, fierce hunger of survivors. Rowan sat in the corner, hands pressed together, listening to the creak of the house settle around them. He let the hush do its work. He had never been good with the words that might make such nights less sharp. "You should rest," Santos said to Clara, his voice a low chord. "Tea, bread, we'll get you cleaned. The cut on your lip, I'll stitch it if you want." Clara's hands trembled as she arranged June. She looked at Rowan and saw the salt line that was grief at the edge of his features. There was a tilt to his mouth, a scar over his brow, the dull ache that belonged to men who had known a different kind of taking. She had seen men like him in town, the ones who mended fences for the price of their hurt. She found herself wanting to know the story that sat behind his eyes, even as the night's quiet wrapped her like a blanket. "You came out into that," she said finally, and the question was all she could manage. "You could have?" "I couldn't not," Rowan answered simply. The sentence had a hard economy to it, as if he were speaking of something he had resolved long before. "I've lost someone I couldn't save. I won't do that again if I can stop it." He did not elaborate, but the truth hung there. In the dim kitchen, by the lamp, Clara pressed a cool cloth to her lip and listened to the scrape of a chair as Rowan shifted. June's breath evened. Outside, thunder stamped and pawed. A night breeze came over the prairie and cooled the dust. Santos boiled sweet tea and broiled a thin slice of beef. The homestead filled with the humble commerce of saving, a patch, a bandage, the folding of blankets. Maggie Duncan's name came into the quiet, a mention as natural as bread. Clara had been making her way to Maggie's place, to the sister who had sent word months ago. "Come on, we need you settled. The spring will be ours in summer." The Winslow women were practical. They did not make the journey for pleasure. They went for land, for future, for the ragged promise of children running under the cottonwoods. Clara did not speak of Tom Breslin's last words. The driver had only murmured and slept, and then bled in silence while Santos laid him beneath a blanket on the porch. There would be time for funerals and for that other work of the prairie. Tonight, the child was warm and alive, and the cut on Clara's lip would heal. Those were small mercies, and, for now, enough. Rowan moved as if the cottage had always been his shelter, as if the nights were meant to be kept by men like him. He sat across from Clara, and let the conversation come in cautious fragments. The weather, the condition of the roads, Maggie's voice on a letter the size of a page. Clara told him she had been a seamstress once, before the fever took her husband 3 winters ago. She spoke of June's birth with a tenderness that made Rowan's jaw soften. He told her, in a few sparse strokes, of the rever that had taken his family. He had carried that story around long enough to have it be almost unremarkable to him to say it out loud. The telling did not ease the memory, but it made it neighbor to other facts, and that is how a man begins to mend. There was a peace in the house that night that surprised them both. June slept with the rattle of a nearby clock like a small, steady drum. The ranch felt like a place that wanted to keep them. Yet the frontier had its ledger. It balanced bounty with threat. A white piece of paper did not change that equation. The next morning a rider came, his horse's flank flecked with sweat, his cap pulled low. He bore the sigil of Consincade's brand on his saddle leather. Even before he spoke, Rowan and Santos had that look between them, a quick, sharp exchange that was less question than recognition. Dawson Consincade's reach was long in the valley. He had a house like a squat mountain and herds that moved like an army. He was the sort of man who could make a claim sound like fate. Word is, the rider said without ceremony, Consincade's men have been pushing the north claims, wanting the spring that sits behind the Duncan place. Says them homesteaders ought to sell to avoid trouble. Rowan's jaw tightened. They've no right to take what's been claimed fair and square. The rider shrugged. Rights are a notion in books. Consincade's got men and money. He wants the spring to water his stock through drought, and he offers a price not many can refuse. Clara's fingers tightened around her cup. Maggie's homestead was nearby, less than a day's ride. The name hung in the room like a hot coal. Dawson Consincade had been a shadow on every talk in the market, a rumor made whole. He did not take kindly to women who would not sell out, not to homesteaders who stubbornly held to their land. "Did he say anything about the woman that came through yesterday?" the rider asked. "You had a lady and a babe with a wagon. She looked to be in need." The rider's eyes slid, reading the room. Consincade's always had a mind for leverage. I'd not be surprised if he thought to use family matters to his advantage. Rowan felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the morning wind. Use Clara as leverage? The notion was a slow, souring thing. He saw already the way a powerful man could turn sympathy into stratagem, press a family until they sold the land he wanted. The spring was small, but it crowned the low valley with water in summer, and in a dry region, such a thing was gold. "Tell him he won't find willing buyers here," Rowan said, voice flat. It was a statement less of bravado than of an attempt to place a line between what he would allow and what he would not. "And tell him if he comes near the Winslow or the Duncans with threats, he'll find more than an empty house waiting." The rider tipped his hat, and he did not look convinced. "He don't like being told no," the man said, and there was the warning in his tone. He left with a turn of his horse that sent dust into the air, and left a thin, harsh quiet in his wake. News in these parts moved in the voice of riders and the creak of wagon wheels. By afternoon, hunters came to the ranch with small reports. Consincade's hand had been seen around the river crossing. A barn had burned to a skeleton near the Morrison claim. Someone's store had been ransacked. Small cruelties, the sort meant to make people sell before a stronger force is needed. The valley seemed to tilt towards something worse. At the boundary of the ranch, Maggie Duncan's letter rested on the table, folded into neat corners like a map to a future she and her husband Thomas had planned. Clara read it again, the lines promising land and a roof and a water share. Those lines had been why she left town, why she had faced the trail with a baby in her lap. If Consincade had designs on the spring, then they would be bargaining in a currency Clara had been trying to defend since the moment her husband died. Rowan moved through the day like a man putting stakes into possible futures. He tightened straps, checked Thunder's shoes, walked the fence lines in the heat. He spoke to Santos in low voices about neighbors. Who could be asked to come to a meeting? Who would bring a rifle if need be? Who could testify to deeds? He did not mention fear in any larger term, but his hands told another story. They were steady, but they had the thrum of urgency beneath the surface. That evening, a small gathering formed in the ruddy light of the ranch's kitchen. Neighbors came. Bill Weatherby with his 2 sons, a stoic man from the Chen family who ran a small stall of produce, a thin-legged Cooper who knew the riverbeds like his own hands. They sat with boiled coffee and hard bread. The talk was quiet but urgent. Kinsintade's tactics had been more than rumors. Language shifted to plans. "We can't let one man's greed drive out half a valley," Thomas Duncan said. He had come that night, having ridden out at Clara's mention of Maggie's name. His voice was calm, a measure. "There's law. Marshal Briggs will take a look, if we stand together, if we show him what's been done." "We could stand and wait," a neighbor suggested, "but waiting's the same as selling sometimes." "Or we can make a stand now," Rowan said, and the room turned to him because he said what others feared to say. "We gather testimony. We mark the damage. We tell Briggs to come with the force he needs to keep a powerful man honest. We don't hide. We don't surrender land because of a bully." There was a hush as the suggestion landed. It was not a heroic speech. It was a plan, like a skeleton one, covered with cloth. Resolute, simple, necessary. Clara listened from the doorway, June asleep at her breast, and felt a hard, unfamiliar thing settle inside her. Gratitude mixed with a new band of feeling, not merely relief, but a desire to see what would happen if she did not run from trouble, but faced it. She had been thinking, in the dark hours with the baby, about how to be safe, how to make a life for June far from the smallness of their losses. The thought of being used as leverage by Kinsincade made her blood tighten with a protective heat she had not remembered being able to find. "We'll call a meeting in town with Briggs and the folks. Let him hear it straight," Thomas said. "Kinsincade's men have to be seen. We can have men at the bridge and witness to the burnings. If it's law he wants, then law will show him his place." Rowan's face did not soften. He had stood at water's edge and known the hollow fact of not being able to bring back what he'd loved. Here, there was a chance to make a stand that might mean more than his own private grief. It was a different sort of rescue, the rescue of a valley, of claims, of the right to plant corn without looking over a shoulder. He found he wanted that rescue as much as he had wanted to catch a child's fall. "Tell me where the fire was," he said, and the map of the valley began to reorder itself in his head. Bridges, burns, the faint line where Kinsincade's grays may begin. Santos nodded. The old man had seen the signs of a powerful ranch hand's campaign before, the pattern of small cruelties meant to tilt people's will. That night, the ranch kept watch. Torches were set, guard rotations organized. Clara could not sleep for the thrum under her breast where June lay with the steady press of life. She had never married for money, for safety. Her husband had been a kind man who had left her with a few things and a baby and a grief too big for a small town. She had thought to find her sister and perhaps a new life, not a war. Rowan sat by the window as the stars came out, his silhouette a dark shape against the lamplight. Thunder stood in the stable, quiet as a thought. Rowan's fingers traced the scar above his brow absent-mindedly, as if mapping the old pain. When Clara came to him with a cup of tea, he accepted it with a small nod. "You saved her," she said, and in that simple sentence there was more than gratitude. It was an assessment, a weighing. "You could have stayed out of it." "I couldn't stand by," he answered, as he had the night she arrived. "Not that time, not ever again if I can help it." She considered him then, truly saw the man with his marked hands and weathered face. There was something unyielding about him, and in that firmness, a promise that did not need words to be understood. "Thank you," she said quietly, and the words, for once, meant more than any declaration could. They were the first thread in something fragile and new. News reached them at dusk of another small intimidation. A barn watched from a rise in the ridge. A neighbor threatened while he slept. The valley was tightening into a circle of menace. Kincaid did not send a letter. He sent pressure. The pattern was old. Push until the line broke. Rowan gathered the neighbors again the next day for a formal talk. A meeting in the town square was set with the instruction that Marshal Briggs would be present. Men and women who would not have come to a gathering for the price of a cow turned out because the foe was the sort one felt in the marrow. Clara found herself among them. June rapped against her chest, and the sight of that small figure drew whispers of sympathy that might be used by powerful men. Rowan felt the weight of it, and the heat of protectiveness rose in him like a tide. Before the meeting began, while chairs were being set and coffee was poured, a rider appeared on the road bearing a mark the valley knew like a bad omen. Garrett Kincaid's brand. Garrett was Dawson's son, whose presence in the valley meant trouble came with a swagger. He rode a dark horse, his jaw set, and when he saw Clara there with the child, he smiled. And it was the sort of smile used to measure people's courage. "Stranger," he called, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "I never suspected Kincaid would be meddling where women are concerned. You'd best think on your papers or find a good price. Men like us don't wait for seasons." A hush fell. Rowan's knuckles whitened on the back of a chair. The crowd shifted like a field of dry grain in a wind. Garrett's words were a brand in the air, thin, menacing, deliberate. The implication was plain. Sell before you lose what you have. The cowardice of reduced options was an intended yield. Rowan stepped forward. His reply was measured and cold. "You speak for your master if you must. We speak for our claims and for our children. We have law. We'll have the marshal hear us." Garrett's grin tightened. He looked at Clara, then away. "Law's slow," he said. "There are things law can't fix." Rowan's reply was a look. He made no speech then. But when Marshal Briggs rode in and took his place near the courthouse steps, the lines began to be drawn in a clearer light. Briggs was a broad man, with a face like a weathered map. He listened as neighbors testified about burnings, about threats, about missing livestock. He took down names and rode off to see the damage. The law had a measured pace, but it had more weight than a single ranch hand's threat. For some, that was comfort. For others, it was not enough. Clara left the meeting with June asleep against her chest, her eyes raw with the strain of hope and fear in equal measure. The valley had teeth, and they were bared. She walked back to Rowan's ranch under a sky like pressed tin, and the porch light was a small, stubborn hearth in a world that felt colder than it had the day before. That night, as torches were stoked and men whispered plans of watch and guard, Clara found herself standing on the step, the cool air lifting the hem of her skirt. Rowan joined her, and for a moment they stood in silence, the small, shared pause before action, an intimate thing on the edge of calamity. "You could leave," Clara said at last, more to the night than to him. "You could go in the dark and take me away. We could make a new way, without the trouble of these men." Rowan's laugh was soft and empty. A life built on never standing up for neighbors is no life at all. Besides, you have a sister. You have family who will stand. I can't turn my back on the place that gives me a reason to care. She reached out then and touched the line of his jaw. His skin was rough under her fingers. The scar made a small ridge. For both of them, the past shaped the present like an old map, folds and stains and places to watch. They did not need to speak of vows. There were other battles to fight first. When morning rose, the sky was a flat sheet of light. The prairie lay still as if holding its breath. Men took their stations, some on the bridge, some at the barn, some along the ridge. Women kept the children close and barred the shutters. The valley readied itself like a community going to prayer. And yet, even as they prepared, the sense of menace had a life of its own. Scouts reported seeing a small party of riders by the old corral on the far side of the Morrison claim, too many to be mere stragglers. Rumors traveled faster than the slow march of law, a plan, a night raid, a test to see whether a community would fold. Rowan's mouth was a line. He tightened Thunder's girth again, checked saddle leather, and looked up toward the ridge where the riders might come. When he looked back at Clara, he saw in her face a mixture of fear and something fiercer, an unwillingness to surrender June to the possibility of being used as a bargaining chip. He thought then of that small body in his arms the day before, the little pulse beneath his palm. There are moments in a man's life when the world offers him a single small duty and expects him to keep it. Rowan had kept it. Now the valley needed more. Santos came to him, his face a book of patient lines. "They're testing us," he said. "They'll press until someone cracks. We don't crack." Rowan nodded. "We keep our counsel. We watch. If they come with fire, we'll answer with witness. If they come with guns, then we'll guard what we can." It was an ultimatum made of small, sure words. The ranchers listened, the women watched, the children slept. The valley braced. In the hush before action, Clara wrapped June and held her so close the child's breath warmed the seam of her shirt.
She did not say a prayer aloud, only whispered, and the whisper was its own iron. "Stay with me, small one. Stay." They did not yet know the shape the next strike would take, whether it would be a raid in the night or a show of force beneath the town's noon sun. The valley's future narrowed to a single fact. Someone had stirred the hornet's nest, and the hornets had smelled blood. They had no time to be wise. They had time only to be ready. There, beneath the wide sky, the people who would be called upon to defend their homes made preparations. The sound of hammers and the creak of the barn filled the afternoon. Men moved like soldiers in a slow, necessary drill. Women sewed brighter flags, bandaged old wounds, loaded small arms with the same hands that churned butter and mended shirts. A community that had loved its peace would learn how to keep it. As dusk gathered and the torches were lit, there came the shadow of mounted men on the ridge, figures that moved like a slow wave, their approach a thin, deliberate sound. Rowan took the hill with several neighbors and watched them come closer. They were not yet a mob, they were a measuring of force. But in the lead, on a dark horse with a face like a closed door, sat Garrett Kinsinkide. Rowan tightened his jaw and drew a breath that tasted of dust and iron. He could see the set of Garrett's shoulders, the way he rode as if the land were already his. The valley held its breath. Clara, with June at her breast, watched from the porch as the men faced one another across the low expanse, and for a moment the two groups were frozen pictures, men and women and babies arrayed against the slow-motion silhouette of power. When Garrett rode forward and called out, his voice slid over the plain like a blade. He intended to mark territory with words as much as with movement. Rowan slipped from his mount and walked forward to meet him in that bright, uncertain space where threats were made and defiance had to be measured. "You come to force a sale?" Rowan asked, though the question was more a demand for clarity. Garrett's smile was a razor. "I come to remind you who holds sway in these parts. Kinsinkide owns more than pasture, Mr. Hale. He owns facts. Facts are what make folks change their minds." Rowan met the smile with a look that was steadier than his voice. Facts can be altered by witness and law. If he's got a complaint, he takes it to the marshal. He doesn't make threats in the names of babes. Rowan felt something harden in his chest as he spoke. It was not just anger. It was a man's refusal to be rendered impotent by the bravado of others. Garrett's men shifted in their saddles. For all the show of muscle, the line of neighbors behind Rowan had weight beyond its number. They had community, and that counted for something in a place where reputation could be the heavier coin. Garrett laughed then, a short, sharp thing. "We'll see if that be enough." Smoke stains on a distant rise, Someone had been testing the line again. They made their plans with a blunt honesty. Men and women who had never before thought to rifle their neighbor gathered tools and testimony instead. Papers that showed the Duncans' claim, ledger marks that proved who had paid taxes, neighbors who would swear to seeing Kinsinkaside riders near the bridge. Rowan and Thomas mapped where a raid might come and where they would meet it. They divided watches and stashed children in cellars and behind barrel staves. The valley had learned to make a fortress of what it had. Clara moved with the same simple, necessary competence she had shown since she first clutched June to her breast. She helped secure jars and fold quilts against smoke. She tied June's bonnet on a little more tightly and practiced opening the root cellar hatch until her hands moved without the jiggle of fear. There was a steadiness building in her that surprised her. Old grief could have made her small, but the baby at her breast and the neighbors at her shoulder made smallness too costly. Rowan put a man at every likely approach and kept Santos moving like a current between them, an old hand whose eyes heard where others only saw. At dusk, they sat in the barn's shadow and passed around coffee that had cooled to the edge of warmth, whispering low as if too much sound would call trouble to their door. It was the night's hush that made the arrival feel sudden, a low thud of hooves in the distance, a darker scrape as riders took shape over the crest. Lanterns winked like false stars along the ridge. The men took their places. Garrett Kinsinkaside's party came like a rumor made flesh. 13 men, a few with faces unshaved and eyes hard. They did not shout a challenge. They did not ride openly into town for the law to find them. They came in the kind of small numbers a bully uses to test who will stand. The first shot came as a quick flare in the night, meant more to startle than to do lasting harm. A burned lash against the barn door meant to drive panic, the idea that fire would frighten and drive the stock away. Rowan heard that small, cruel sound and felt the blood in his ears become ice. He had stood at water that had taken his children. He had no patience for a man who thought to steal a well with the ease of showing teeth. "Hold the lane," he murmured, and the neighbors answered. They were not a uniform militia. They were farmers, seamstresses, blacksmiths, people who had learned to work with what they had and to tell the truth plain. They held the line, not because they wished to fight, but because they wished to live. The difference was sharp enough to be a weapon. Clara, with June tucked on her chest beneath a coarse skirt, descended into the root cellar with Maggie and a handful of women. The air was cool and smelled of dried herbs and last year's potatoes. They barred the hatch and sat in a close ring, the light of a single lantern between them making small islands of gold in the dark. Above, the barn door flapped as a grappling hoe took hold. Men cursed in the night, and someone tried to set a torch. The sounds came down through the floorboards like wind through a seam. At the first heavy crash on the porch, June stirred and made a small noise that echoed like a bell in Clara's ear. She clamped a hand over the child's mouth and breathed the child's breath against her cheek as though the rhythm could keep everything steady. Maggie's knuckles were white on the hatching. Thomas's voice came muffled from above as he gave orders. Rowan moved with a kind of cold efficiency once the action began. There was no heroic bravado to it, only the single-minded business of keeping people alive and making sure no desperate man could take at the point of a gun what he thought could be bought by fear. He met Garrett's men at the lower rise and answered their taunts with the steady sound of men who could aim. Sparks jumped and flared, horses snorted. Santos, in the thick of it, had a sling and a stick, and the relaxed confidence of knowing where to place a shot that would stop a rider's mount but not take a life unless it had to. "Stay to the east," Rowan called, voice flat as the ridge. "Don't let them circle the house." They took the fight in the open spaces at first, rifle fire crackling like the sound of flint on stone, the thump of heavy boots answering. But Garrett, reckless and desperate, tried the deed that made his name a curse. He rode in toward the porch, flanked by 2 men with ropes and a plan to drag a woman from a porch and use her as a bargaining chip.
There was a moment as breathless as the one when June had fallen from Clara's lap. A small universe in which a man's decision bent the axis of another's life. Garrett saw Clara through the lamplight and pointed. He laughed like someone who thought the world owed him room to take. Rowan moved as if pulled on a string. He was not thinking of poetry. He was thinking of that child's wrist in his hands the day before, of the hollow ache that had taught him how merciless a loss could be. He met Garrett's horse at the porch with a rush and a word. No. They met in a collision not of fists alone, but of wills. Rowan rode forward, braced, and Garrett, finding his swagger met with the hard line of a man who would not back down, misjudged. His horse stumbled on the uneven ground by the hitching rail, and for a bare second he was off balance. Rowan had him then, not in a duel, but by the simple use of force. He blocked Garrett's arm and knocked the rope from the man's grip. Men rushed. The fight turned personal as it always would under those conditions, but it retained the restraint of neighbors who would rather own the moral cost of a bruised bone than leave a mother bereft.
There was shouting. Thomas, as he pushed back a second attacker, Bill Weatherby flinging a pack over a man's head, Cooper tackling a footman. Santos shouted in a low voice and struck the butt of his rifle so it made contact with a man's ribs. The man fell groaning, less seriously hurt than stunned. The goal was not blood. No one in that ring wanted a neighbor dead, but to break the men enough that Marshal Briggs could take them where he would. Garrett tried to seize a heel to drag Clara from the cellar steps, but his hand found instead the hard palm of Rowan's grip. "Get your hands off her," Rowan said, and the tone worked like a rope around Garrett's throat. The younger man had not expected resistance. He had expected fear. Instead, he met the grim line of a man who'd walked into a herd for a child's life and would do the same again. A neighbor, Cooper, threw himself at Garrett's legs and brought the man down. Men pinned him with ropes. The bit of theater Garrett had intended collapsed into a sight of a seized man and the quiet mending of the torn seam of a small, hot community resisting a broken confidence. Above them, a lantern tossed and died. A man tried to set a hayrick aflame, but found the pitch already doused by hands who had anticipated such a trick. The barn would blacken, bearing the marks of scars, but it would not be the fuel for the finale. By dawn, several of Garrett's men lay bound or headed down the track toward the marshal's wagon. Others had fled with sore shoulders and fists that stung. The night's shape had changed into morning's duty: take statements, tend the wounded, inventory losses. Tom Breslin's body had been moved into the shade. There was no triumph in their elsewise victory, only a tired, clear-eyed assessment of what had been avoided. Rowan knelt in the yard with his hands on his knees, the way a man does when a long stretch of tension finally slackens. He watched as two of Consinkenside's men were thrown up against a gate and held there until the marshal and his deputies could take them. Marshal Briggs himself rode in with a few slower men, his presence a legal weight more than a show of force. He took in the scene with the gaze of one who had been given too many such reckonings, and had learned the difference between accusation and truth. "You kept your heads," Briggs said at last, voice a low, satisfied rumble. "You kept the law, and you held each other. That's right." Briggs's authority gave the valley a firm hinge on which to hang its complaint. He took statements, gathered witnesses, and promised to take the names of those who had attacked. Garrett, swearing and red-faced, protested his treatment with the stubbornness of someone who thought himself entitled. The marshal laughed and bound him in iron, the clink of those cuffs sounding like the basins settling in a church. The law moved then in the cumbersome but certain way of things with weight. Briggs sent a deputation to the nearest territorial town, where a magistrate would hear charges and where an official wagon could carry the captured men. Word went with it. A trial would be held if the judge's time permitted, and testimony would be brought. Dawson Kincaid's name became a thing people mentioned in lower tones. He had not been captured, but the evidence of his men's acts lay in charcoal on the ground and in the witness of a valley. For a while there was a different kind of combat, the labor of recovery. They repaired the barn, the men blackened with toil and black smoke, and the women sewed and mended, patched shirts and breaded wounds. Clara sat at the kitchen table at Rowan's ranch and listened to the hammering and the saw. She was exhausted from the night's fear, but the fear had a different edge now. It was the fear that has been met and bested, leaving an ache that is almost the shape of a muscle learned. In the weeks that followed, the valley's ledger tilted toward consequence. Marshal Briggs's deputies returned with a list of names, testimony from fields and fences, and enough witness to bring charges not only against Garrett and 2 of his men, but, by extension, against Dawson for hiring and sending the raiding party. The process was not swift. In the territorial circuits of those years, law crawled along with the horses and the steam. Depositions were taken, bonds posted, witnesses summoned. Yet the legal engine turned with purpose. It was the testimony of many that carried weight. Neighbors who had earlier been reluctant to step forward found courage in the fact that they'd stood together at the barn, and that their signatures had real weight. The judge, when the case finally came to him in the county seat, listened to each testimony with a kind of weary focus. He had seen men like Kincaid in courtroom plays before, powerful, accustomed to getting results by the weight of their purses and their intimidation. But the law had the neighborly string that bound people to truth. The paper deeds, the cross-examination that revealed arrogance, the unvarnished evidence of burned property, of threats, of intent. Garrett's trial was the main act. He tried to speak loudly, to make himself seem like a victim of misinterpretation. The jury saw through the bluster. He was found guilty of assault and malicious intimidation. The judge sentenced him to a term that would be long enough to be felt, a sentence that carried the moral heft of community rebuke. Others were fined and ordered to make restitution for damages to the barn and to livestock. Dawson himself, while he evaded a prison cell through clever use of land holdings and legal counsel, found the county's sympathies turning against him. He was sued by those whose property he'd targeted, and the law moved to seize his assets to pay to those it had wronged. He was left a diminished man, his spread broken by debts and the loss of the spring that had made him necessary in the first place. It was not perfect justice. Law in those parts had its limits. A man of Dawson's resources could buy time and paper. But for the valley, the important thing was that the pattern he had used, first small cruelties, then louder threats, had been exposed and punished enough to keep him from making life unbearable. More importantly, the community had found a muscle it did not know it had, a willingness to stand together and to use the law, not only the gun, to protect rights. Through the tangle of trials and testimonies, Rowan and Clara lived in the quiet space between conflict and healing. Rowan performed small, concrete cares, new shingles on the porch, laboring at the Duncan and Winslow fences, mending a child's shoe. Clara, who had once thought to move simply for a place to live, found herself laying roots that reached beyond mere shelter. They shared the small dignity of someone who cares for another, boiling a slightly too weak tea because it was needed, setting a patch on a shirt where a boy had snagged it on a nail. It was small work, but it had the weight of fidelity. In those weeks of rebuilding, conversation loosened. Words that had been heavy with fear became lighter, edged with humor. Rowan's tales of working fences turned into something less raw, not confessions, but glimpses of a man whose grief had tempered into a quiet public service. He told Clara, one afternoon as they stacked wood, of the river and the night he could not save his family. He said it not to make compassion, but because truth between them had become a kind of salve. "I thought if I stepped in front of things," he said, his voice low as the kindling, "I could fix what couldn't be fixed. I didn't know grief could be lessening only in the company of other people.
I only learned to stand by having others to stand beside." Clara listened, her hands smelling of sap and cedar. "You did step," she said simply. "You stepped and you stayed. That is how things mend sometimes." They spun small plans into the long afternoons. Rowan fixed a broken feed trough, and Clara sewed a new cover for June's cradle. She would tell him about the way Maggie laughed at the sewing, at the stubbornness of a woman who could cut a dress pattern with a bandana and still make work of it. Rowan told her about Thunder's foibles, how the stallion refused to step into water unless coaxed with a carrot. It was a domesticity neither had expected, but both had come to want. Once the law had taken its first steps, and the immediate threat had quieted to a hum of concern, Rowan said something to Clara that altered the slope of their days. They had returned late from the market to find the house unlit and June asleep in the cradle. The night had the clean smell of cedar from the barn rafters and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. He took her hand, rough and calloused, in a manner that did not require grand speech. He had not the energy for flourishes, only the simple asking of a life to be shared. "Clara," he said, voice low, "stay with me. Not for days or nights, but for the kind of thing that names a place. Will you be my partner at the house and the field? Will you come with me where the work is, and the small mornings keep us together?" Clara considered, the gravity of the request weighing like a basket on her hands. She had been widowed young, and had learned how vows could be both shelter and fold. She had seen how men could disappear behind their own hurt. There was no need for a theatrical answer. She smiled, weary and real. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, when I'm ready." He laughed, a small delighted sound, and took her in a way that was less ceremony than promise. They married in the autumn under a small arch of cottonwood leaves, surrounded by their neighbors. The marriage was both modest and raucous, the sort of day the valley liked. Too much coffee, too little cake, a hymn sung off key but with real heart. Maggie was there with Thomas, holding June, who toddled between the skirts with a sticky hand and a curious eye. Santos stood near Rowan, with a look that was almost proud. He had watched the whole delicate plan of a man's life tilt toward repair, and there was a wise man's smile about it. Years, as they do, abbreviated and smoothed the jagged edges. The couple's marriage was less an event than a continuing act of attention, mending the fence where storm had made a hole, holding a child's fever through the night, leaking laughter over an inside joke that began with a mule named Thunder who believed himself royalty. They had children, 2 more after June, who herself grew into a headstrong, sun-faced girl, and settled into rhythms the valley called ordinary: planting, harvest, tending to neighbors. Dawson, diminished and watching his creditor circle, found that the landscape of power had changed. The spring he had once believed could be bought was no longer simply his. A court decree had recognized the rightful claims around it, and the water was fenced with more than mere posts. Compensations were made where they could, land sold, prices settled, and the valley's economy creaked but held. Garrett served his term and returned older and quieter. Some things in a man harden with time, others soften. He left the valley, a name that would be mentioned only in the context of those evenings when neighbors toasted to trouble survived. Marshall Briggs, who had a taste for fairness, remained the kind of lawman men would tell their children about. Strict, sometimes stern, but a bulwark against the rule of purse and muscle. He would come by the ranch in later years, sit on Rowan's porch, and exchange dry jokes. "You did well," he would say, and Rowan would shrug, as if there were nothing brave in the things he'd done. But those small, quiet words of approval were like a sun-warmed stone. They settled warm in man's chest. Clara watched the slow healing of her life with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. There were mornings when grief still rose like a draft through the house, unexpected and cold, but they had a different hue now, less of the hollowed-out ache and more of a memory that had been woven into the fabric of a broader life. She would walk with June under the cottonwoods where the path bent and speak to the child as one does to a tender thing that needs direction and discipline. She did not romanticize the past. She kept it whole and told June the shape of it when the child asked. They returned one spring to the field where the herd had stampeded the day that had reshaped their lives. The ground was softer now, the ruts filled by rain and pasture, the ghost prints of hooves smooth with grass. Rowan led their horse, Thunder, then older and graying at the muzzle, while Clara walked with June, the girl's hand tucked into her mother's. The place held a hush that was not sadness, but a kind of reverence. It was a place where the world's worst and best had been braided, a child's near loss and a man's willing leap. They stood there, and Rowan put his hand in Clara's. "You remember," he said, not as a plea, but as a bond. "How could I not?" Clara answered. "The day the bull went wild is the day I learned what a man could do for a child who wasn't his. It's the day we started to belong to each other and to this valley." June, now old enough to skip the small stones on the path and still young enough to be impatient with grown talk, ran to the fence and climbed up to look. Her shadow fell across the same furrows where hooves had once reared. The plot of land had softened but not forgotten. In her face was the untroubled certainty of a child who had always known a solid tether, a mother who would not let go, and a father who would leap. Years later, years that knit them to the earth and to each other, their house was large with children's laughter and too many chairs at the table. The valley had a different rhythm now, more fences mended than burnt, more harvests shared than stolen, more neighbors who voiced a grievance in cohort than hid one in fear. The Duncan spring ran with the steadiness of a hand kept from rash use, and the station of the valley had shifted from the rule of one powerful man's whim to the steady power of community. Rowan would sometimes wake early in the gray light and walk to the porch alone, finding in the length of his morning a deliberate calm he had not known as a younger man. He would think of the river and the child and the way a life could break and still be put back together. Those thoughts no longer cut, they smoothed. He had learned to measure his duty not by the width of his pain, but by the measure of his presence.
Clara, standing by the window after the children had been sent off to school, would watch the dust lift on the road and think of the day a bull had thundered and a man had chosen to go into harm. She kept a small box beneath her bed with a ribbon from June's first bonnet and a scrap of the blanket Rowan had used the day they arrived at the ranch. They were small things, and yet they were the nails by which they built a life. There was no grand, towering sermon in their ending, no miracle cloaked them in the impossible. What they had was the work of neighbor and law and the slow, certain healing that comes when people tend one another. That, in itself, felt like a kind of grace, something quieter than a thunderbolt, but deeper than any single flash. On clear days they took their children back to where the stampede had started. The pasture was kinder in spring, a place where the memory of hooves had been softened by grass, and the world had room to be both the site of danger and the site of belonging. Clara would sit under the cottonwoods while Rowan taught their eldest to mend a fence, not as a lesson in war, but as a lesson in stewardship. "Keep what you love mended," he would say, and the child would file the words away, the way young people keep seeds for later planting. Years made something both brittle and steady, the knowledge that misfortune could come at any moment, and the conviction that standing together changed the odds. That lesson sat in the porch light, in the way neighbors borrowed a cup of sugar or a wagon wheel for the day, in the slow, trustless business of doing business with a man whose past had been sharp and whose present was more generous. On an evening not unlike the one when the herd had first broken, they went down the trail toward the hollow. June, now taller than the little hand that had once moved like a frightened bird, walked between her parents. The sun sat bronze on the backs of the hawks. The place that had once been the stage for panic now held their family as if it had always meant to hold them. Rowan stopped and put his hand on the rail of the old fence, the wood rough under his palm. He looked at Clara, and there was no need for the kinds of speeches made by men in books. He had done what he could. He had run into danger, he had stood in the dark, he had tended what had been broken. The world had repaid him with a life he would not have expected but had earned through simple acts of fidelity. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder.
"We were lucky," she said at last, but the word was not the bell of chance ringing in a hollow. It was the note of gratitude tuned by years of work. "We were more than lucky," Rowan answered. "We had neighbors who would not let fear win, and a law that listened when we spoke. We had hands to help carry the rest." June ran ahead then, chasing the shadow of a dog. Her laughter cut the air, clear and free.
Behind her, the rails showed no fresh scars. The field had smoothed its wounds under another season's grass. The valley would remember the day the bull had gone wild, not as a wound, but as the moment that shaped the form of their togetherness. It became the story they told at winter suppers, and there, by the lamp, they would recall the women's and men's faces who had turned up to make a stand when it was needed most. When the story reached its telling, when the children asked how a man could run toward something everyone else ran from, Clara would hold them and say simply, "Because he could not live with himself otherwise." Rowan would add more quietly, "I ran because his life was a thing I could hold. That's what we do with what we can hold." They let the past sit in their laps like an animal that had been hurt but not killed. It had long memories, and it needed to be treated with steady hands. The hollow where grief once had lived was full now of bread stored for winter and of small toys laid away for grandchildren. The place that had once known the sound of frantic hooves now knew children's feet. The day had bent them into something stronger, not by removing sorrow, but by teaching them where to put strength, a place that would not be used to bully, but to keep. That was the lesson and the truth. If someone asked what they'd learned by the end of it, what the day of the stampede had finally given them, Clara would answer with a look at the little ones who chased each other across the field and at the man who had once stepped into a churn of danger for a child's life. "It gave us each other," she'd say, "and when the world came loud, we found our quiet in one another." Rowan would stand and watch the sun sink, and for once not feel the old raw need to fix everything. He had a house and a woman who had consented to stand with him, and those things were enough to hold back a lot of what the present could throw at them. He had survived a hard lesson and found, in its wake, a place where he belonged. They walked home together, the children already arguing over who had found the best stick. The wind smelled of grass and of promise. The fence they had mended creaked softly as they passed. The valley slept at last, settled by the steady work of a community that had rediscovered itself. If you felt this story in your bones, if somehow it reached you across the miles and the years, remember the shape of standing, neighbors who keep watch, a law that hears, and a single brave act that can change the course of a life. Subscribe for more cinematic, true life stories.